Ann Burnett Hall heard that her father, J. Goodwin Hall, had made a colored motion picture of the foundation animals of the American Quarter Horse Association in the period 1937 to 41, she thought it should be made available to people whenever they wanted to see it. The film had been lost, but it was found again, and she thought that since I knew Jim and made several photographic trips with him, that I was a logical person to do it. Yes, Jim Hall was very interested in quarter horses. He was the husband of Ann Burnett Hall. Ann Burnett Hall, of course, was the daughter of Tom Burnett and his heir. And every time that Jim went out to one of the ranches, he saw quarter horses on each trip. As a result, he was all for working with the quarter horse and trying to create an association for the quarter horse. At the original organizational meeting held in Fort Worth on March 15, 1940, Jim was elected as a director. A few weeks later in Houston, the directors had their first meeting, and at that meeting, he was selected as the treasurer. I was selected as a secretary. Bill Warren was selected as president, Jack Hutchin as first vice president, Lee Underwood as second vice president. One of the first assignments that Jim and I had as officers of the AQHA was to plan for a horse show to be held at the first annual convention of the Quarter Horse Association to be held in Fort Worth. Soon after that convention, both Jim and I became involved in World War II. Jim was a reserve major, and he was called up. He had only had a couple, 3 weeks before he had to report to Colorado Springs. He was placed in charge of the 13th Squadron, photographic squadron of the United States Air Force. And he had 37 pilots under him, all P-38 pilots, and about 300 support personnel. He had to leave, and as a result, he threw the film that he had been working on together in a rather rough way because he didn't have time to put it together, organized like he wanted it. And he mailed it to Texas A&M in the name of his wife, Ann Burnett Hall. When Jim sent the film down to College Station, where it became lost and was found by Professor Yates. It was worked over by Yates and Ronnie Blackwell. And then one copy was sent to the Quarter Horse Association. The copy that Professor Yates had, or any other copies that were made of it, have been lost, or at least nobody knows where they are. We have the AQHA film to work with. This film is most important because it is the only film that we have of the horses in 1937 to 1940. It shows horses like the Old Sorrel, a great foundation stallion. It shows horses like Joe Hancock, another one, actually moving and in full color. And for this reason, it represents the only authentic source of information on these animals, outside of a book. Jim was one of the best all-around men I have ever known. He was able to do everything just a little better than other people. He was a top wing shot. He was a big game hunter. He was well known as a pilot, and he was one of the best polo players in Texas. Elliott Roosevelt, who was President Roosevelt's assistant during the war, said that Jim Hall was the most unsung hero of World War II. He returned to the States as a colonel and died in 1952 and was buried in the Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The following film has been reorganized in accordance with Jim Hall's plan. It does include some shots not seen in his original version. These stud books belonged to Jim Hall, as he was also a historian, and he used these stud books in writing his early articles on the quarter horse. The following pictures are made to show how the typical quarter horses were built. No particular added comment seems necessary. This stallion was once thought to be the sire of Tom, but Tom's sire was Badger. Rainy Day was by midnight. All were direct descendants of Peter McHugh. Badger was sired by Peter McHugh. Midnight was sired by Badger. Joe Tom was by Roan Hancock. All of these pictures are aimed to show the quality of the brunette mares and how well they handled. These scenes show Robert J. Kleberg cutting on a ranch quarter horse. This is followed by roping and racing by the King Ranch horses. These pictures show Bob Kleberg riding and reining Baby Grande and Macanudo, two of their superior stallions. Then Bob is shown riding Peppy. Peppy can be identified by his left rear pastern, which is white. Wimpy is also shown, but his left hind foot shows white to the cannon. Katerina was a great using mare belonging to the King Ranch. She won every performance class in which she was entered. She was stolen and taken to Mexico and never recovered. Bob Kleberg is shown riding her in this picture. Lady of the Lake was a great match race mare, one of the greatest ever to live in South Texas. She was sired by Ott Adams' Little Joe. The King Ranch bought her, and her owner moved to the ranch with her. Bill Warren was the first president of the AQHA, and his horses were the first registered. Pancho was his main stallion. He was of Little Joe breeding. Billy and Bill Thomas and Joe Lewis were all stallions owned by Jack Hutchins of Wharton, Texas. Billy was by Grano de Oro and Bill Thomas by Buck Thomas. Joe Lewis is the third horse shown. R.L. Underwood owned Golden Chief. Golden Chief had been given to Underwood by an Amarillo rancher. Underwood tried to trace his pedigree and concluded he was of Copper Bottom breeding. Redwood was by Madway Tenacity and out of Miss Anson. Jim Hall was the first treasurer of the American Quarter Horse Association. In his opinion, Joe Hancock was the best sire on the Burnett ranches. Del Rio Joe was bred by Cooter Wardlaw of Rock Springs and bought as a yearling by myself, Bob Denhardt. He traced back to Harmon Baker, and he was the first grand champion of an official quarter horse show, the one held at Stamford in 1940. Robert J. Clayburgh was the general manager of the King Ranch and one of the earliest breeders of quarter horses. Ott Adams and Dwayne Hughes, two early South Texas breeders. George Clegg took a group of King Ranch horses to the Tucson show. Here he is shown leading one in the confirmation class. Jim Minnick was the first official inspector and show judge appointed by the association. When Jim was judging a show and he could not clearly decide between two horses, he would often ride both and put the blue ribbon on the one which he thought handled the best. Helen Michaelis was the only woman to have great influence on the new Quarter Horse Association. She became secretary and treasurer of the association when Jim Hall and myself left for the war effort. Hugh Bennett was a rodeo star, both in roping and in steer wrestling. He was a prime mover in organizing the Cowboys Turtle Association, which was the first attempt at organizing the rodeo cowboys. He later became president of the AQHA. The Old Sorrel was the foundation sire of the King Ranch quarter horses. Until recently, all of the top lines of their quarter horses traced directly to the Old Sorrel. He was foaled in 1915 and died in 1949. King, owned by Jess Hankins and sired by Santanone, was one of the great sires of the 1940s. This great stallion, owned by the Burnetts, was the outstanding match racing horse of his day. He was also a great sire, with his sons going into several western states where they were raced successfully. Little Joe Jr. was by the Gonzales Joe Bailey. He won almost all of the confirmation shows he was entered in. He also won the stallion race at Tucson. He was owned by Larry Baumer of Utopia, Texas. Lucky Strike was an outstanding sorrel stallion, sired by the Old Sorrel and bred by the King Ranch. He was owned by Will Northington of Egypt, Texas, and was born in 1935. This Wilcox, Arizona horse, Tony, was regarded by most quarter horse men as the best conformed stallion outside of Texas. Ware was one of the original directors of the Quarter Horse Association. The founders all knew that the quarter horse was ideal for cutting, roping, and all ranch work. Jeeps just cannot work cattle like a man on a quarter horse. Thanks to Jim Hall's foresight, we have preserved for all to see some of the great quarter horses of the past.